APEC Trade Ministers are meeting in Detroit. Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao is among those attending and spoke with U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai. CGTN's Hendrik Sabrandi reports from the talks.
Well, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting has wrapped up here in Detroit after 2 days of discussion among representatives of 21 different economies in the Asia-Pacific region. Lots of different issues were discussed. The state of the world's economy in 2023, which has proved to be rather sluggish compared to the past couple of years as we recover from the pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine. Two countries grabbed the headlines here, as you might expect. The two leading economies in the world, the U.S. and China. The Chinese Minister Wang Wentao, along with the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, met on the sidelines of this meeting a little bit earlier on Friday. Both sides have lots of complaints about the other. The U.S. is very concerned about what it calls China's state-led, non-market approach to the economy. It's also very unhappy about some of the actions that have been taken against U.S. companies in China, whether it's raids or investigations or the like, as well as the Section 301 tariffs that were imposed during the Trump administration against Chinese products and services. Those tariffs remain in place nearly 5 years later. China would dearly love to have them lifted. Now, after the discussion on this afternoon, China said it was a candid and pragmatic and in-depth exchange between the two sides. The U.S., for its part, said it demonstrated the need for both sides to continue engaging with each other. No indication that any kind of agreements or resolutions were reached here during the meeting between Wang and Tai, but certainly a step in the right direction after several years of lack of communication, basically no talking between the two sides. Hendrik Sabrandi, CGTN, Detroit.
Okay, a lot to unfold here, and for more on APEC, I'm joined by William Lee, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. William, always a pleasure to see your smiling face. Thanks very much for coming in and chatting with us.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
I got to begin by asking, why Detroit? I mean, when you think of APEC, you don't think of the buckle of the Rust Belt in the United States. What are the positives for having it there?
Well, Sean, it's really an appropriate place for the ministers of trade and ministers of transportation to meet, because what is Detroit, the United States? It's the center of transportation production and also trade with Canada. So it's appropriate that these two ministers meet there because they represent trade and manufacturing in the United States.
That's what I like about you. I tee them up and you knock them out of the park. Let's talk about what the priorities for this meeting were. We talked about, we heard Hendrik talk about some of these concerns. You know, obviously China is very concerned about the tariffs, the ongoing friction in trade, and of course the United States has its own complaints about the way U.S. businesses are handled in China. What are your thoughts on those priorities, and do you see any positive coming out?
It's good that the two sides get together and sort of have a mutual kind of like complaint and gripe session, because we absolutely need to be able to air both sides. But I think the real agenda here is to get the other nations in APEC to try to form trade alliances and to try to have a framework where all benefit from trade with all countries. And I think that's the theme that I think the U.S. and China are trying to develop, because after all, for both the U.S. and for China, the APEC nations are the major trading partners. And China is trying to develop its influence within Asia, especially as manufacturing leaves China, low value added manufacturing into other parts of Asia. The APEC members are a big source of growth for China. Similarly, for the United States, we have to also restructure our supply chains.
Okay, I want to dig more into that, because China has made significant inroads in fostering business ties among APEC nations, where arguably the United States sat on the sidelines in one of the most important negotiating times in recent history and is boxed out in dealing with many of these nations. What could be the positive coming out from countries forging their own alliances, and where does the U.S. stand in all of this?
I think China realizes that its future growth is going to be in a regional setting of Asia, with various ties to Europe as well as the United States. But the main trade ties and financial flows are going to be within Asia. So essentially, that is China's currency area. And what China wants to do is promote the use of the renminbi in Asia with bilateral trade agreements and so on. The United States has to rethink its priorities and say, if we can't have all of our manufacturing based in China, what other sources of natural resources and raw materials and also low-cost labor can the U.S. depend on to bolster its supply chain? And those, of course, will be Asian countries, because Asia is where the bulk of the growth going forward is going to come from. And both countries, U.S. and China, recognize that they have to make new alliances with these countries.
Like many, I am very interested in what Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao could have said on the sidelines with the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai. Your thoughts on this? This is a pretty important one-on-one meeting, even if it's only to say, hey, let's kind of clear the air a bit.
I think Ambassador Tai, was pressing the point, and I'm guessing that we need to be able to trust one another. And what China has done recently with its sanctions against the Micron and investigations in the offices of Bain consulting firm and other kind of moves that kind of make it seem as though China is unfriendly towards foreign capital and foreign trade coming into China. And I think they wanted to clarify exactly what are China's policies going toward foreign investment. And I think the Chinese are trying to settle with the United States. Hey, what is going on with these tariffs? It's been so many years. We have tried to do our best to comply with the China-U.S. trade agreements. And so why are the tariffs still there? Those, I think, are the questions they're asking each other. And I would have loved to hear the answers.
You know, I'd like to hear more on the tariffs, because those arguably affect every consumer anywhere. They don't just punish China. If you're going to buy something in the United States that's made perhaps partially in China, partially in another country, put together in yet a third country, then everybody could feel the effects.
But, you know, Sean, isn't it strange that, people thought that when President Biden came into office that we would see the tariffs come off. But I think people forget the Democratic Party was the most aggressive in arguing for labor fairness and the treatment of labor in various countries and working conditions. In fact, what was mysterious in some ways was, why was it that a free trade administration like Trump's would have put on the tariffs to begin with? And I think the mystery of the tariffs, I think, still stays with us. And as long as we have a Democratic controlled government in the Congress, I think we're going to see these tariffs stay on for quite a while. And the likelihood of them being lifted is going to require some big concessions from China.
I think your next book should be called The Mystery of the Tariffs. Let's talk about the other sideline conversations that went on. Automakers, they clearly have a lot at stake here.
Oh, absolutely. China has become the manufacturer of electric vehicles. In fact, Elon Musk appreciates the Chinese electric car market so much that the bulk of his manufacturing and his most productive plant is in China. And I think China right now is in the position of setting the standard for the future automobiles of the world, especially electric vehicles. And I think that is part of the framework that they're trying to establish with the negotiations in Detroit right now.
Yeah, and a little agreement between Ford and Tesla, and we'll talk more about that later on. But William, always a pleasure. Thanks very much, and have a great holiday weekend here in the U.S.
Thanks for having me, Sean.